Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Representative Mark Green, chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, about extremist threats to the U.S., President Trump's possible wedge strategy to weaken the links between Russia and China, how Congress really feels about Elon Musk and the DOGE, and much more. And we break down the fast-moving developments on the Trump administration's push to end the Russia-Ukraine war, the issue of climate change inside the Defense Department, and a lot more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent here at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We've got a jam-packed show today with an exclusive interview with Representative Mark Green, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. We talk about China, Russia, Ukraine, the DOGE, entitlement reform, mysterious drones, fentanyl, AI, extremist threats to the homeland, and more. So stay tuned for that coming up in just a few minutes. But before we get to that interview, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here with you for another week on the podcast. The top global security development I'm tracking centers on the high-stakes developments around the Trump administration's push for Ukraine-Russia negotiations to end the more than 3-year-old Russian invasion of Ukraine. Before I really dive into that, Ben, there are a couple of quick, smaller things we're tracking at Threat Status. First was the revelation in a report in recent days by the China Aerospace Studies Institute, or CASI. That is a U.S. Air Force think tank, that China's military is now deploying advanced air defense radars capable of detecting stealth aircraft. This is a kind of eye-opening development for U.S. national security and intelligence analysts focused on China's advancing defense capabilities, Ben. The CASI report says the new radars are being deployed on balloons and unmanned aircraft. Threat Status columnist and reporter Bill Gertz has a deep dive on it that we featured in our daily newsletter. A second thing on my radar, Ben, is the way that the Trump administration is now clearly moving to exert what it calls maximum pressure on Iran, essentially trying to cut off all oil revenue going to the Iranian government at a moment of growing concern in Washington over Tehran's nuclear enrichment and ballistic missile programs. The U.S. Treasury and State Departments moved on March 13 to impose sanctions on Iran's oil minister, as well as several Hong Kong-flagged ships that U.S. national security sources say are part of a so-called shadow fleet that Tehran has been using to evade existing U.S. sanctions and move oil to buyers in China and elsewhere. And then, Ben, there are the Ukraine developments. I'm still unpacking what comes next following the breakthrough talks held on March 11 in Saudi Arabia, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Trump National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said after a meeting with a high-level Ukrainian delegation that the Trump administration is now lifting the pause it had put on U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing for Ukraine. Apparently that pause was a bluff to get the Zelensky government in line in Kiev. And of course, the Zelensky government has said in exchange that it now will back the Trump administration's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. This was, of course, a 180-degree reversal from the Oval Office blow-up late last month, Ben, when Zelensky and Trump were essentially at each other's throats. Here's the problem now. Russia seems to be playing a kind of messaging hardball here on whether or not it will accept a ceasefire. Despite having Trump really pander and try to get the Russians to the table by being so critical of Zelensky, and then briefly halting U.S. aid or threatening to, and even sending Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow after the Saudi Arabia breakthrough in recent days. A top foreign policy advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin made headlines on March 13, as we were taping this episode, by basically rejecting the ceasefire idea. That advisor, Yuri Ushakov, appeared on Russian state television while Witkoff was in Moscow. Yuri Ushakov said a 30-day ceasefire would just create breathing room for Ukrainian troops to build up their capabilities, and that what the Putin government would want is to just go straight into substantive peace talks. So this could be a good thing, Ben, but it could also be very bad, as getting such talks going, whether directly between Putin and Trump. Remember, there are rumors that a Trump-Putin summit could be held in Saudi Arabia, or some working level talks and negotiation. That's going to take time. We've seen that in other conflicts around the world, specifically in dealing with North Korea during the first Trump administration. And Russian forces may use that time to push a strategy of basically ramping up attacks on Ukraine in the interim. We're tracking it all, Ben, in the Threat Status daily newsletter, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're already seeing signs of the Russian military ramping up its operations in Kursk to try to recapture some of its territory there. So the initial signs, maybe, depending on how you want to look at this, might not be that encouraging. Last week on the show, Guy, we talked about President Trump's proposal to build a White House Office of Shipbuilding, which would help the Navy and the private commercial shipbuilding industry compete with China. On the military side, I wanted to highlight something this week that our colleague and Times military correspondent Mike Glenn wrote about, and that's how the pay rates for the welders, electricians, and other on-the-ground jobs needed to actually build the ships just aren't competitive in a lot of cases. A Congressional Budget Office analyst, Eric Labs, he told a House hearing this week that some of those electricians, welders, and other jobs, they can get paid essentially $20 or $21 an hour, which isn't all that much more than some people can make working at, retail jobs. So the CBO estimates that to meet the Navy's goal of 381 ships, the Navy has to spend more than $40 billion per year for the next 30 years. For context, the Navy's annual proposed fiscal 2025 budget was $257 billion, which means about 16% of the total budget would need to go to this new shipbuilding initiative. That sounds like a fairly reasonable share of the pie to me. But of course, that number is going to go up drastically and really fast if we start paying more competitive salaries to get talented, skilled workers to do the hard work necessary. So we'll see how this all squares with DOGE and cost cutting across the Defense Department. It's something I'm personally pretty interested in, so I'll be monitoring it for us here at Threat Status. And speaking of cost cutting across the Defense Department, here's something else I've written a lot about over the years that really jumped out to me over the past couple of days. Listeners may have seen that a few days ago, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said on X that, quote, "The Department of Defense does not do climate change crap. We do training and war fighting," unquote. This came on the heels, Guy, of the Pentagon announcing it was ending more than 90 research studies funded by Defense Department money. They said this will save $30 million this year alone and more in future years. Now, some of these studies have to do with climate change, extreme weather, and the associated problems they can cause. For example, there was a study of the climate food urbanization nexus and the precursors of instability in Africa, the social and institutional determinants of vulnerability and resilience to climate hazards in the African Sahel, and others. Is this a good use of taxpayer money through the Defense Department? You can probably make a case that it's not, and a lot of Republicans are making that case. But here's where it gets tricky. Some Senate Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren and Tammy Duckworth this week, sent a letter to Secretary Hegseth pointing out things like this, that in 2018, hurricanes caused $8 billion in damage to Camp Lejeune and Tyndall Air Force Base. Flooding at Offutt Air Force Base in 2019 has cost over $1 billion. The Air Force says that rebuilding Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, which was hit by a typhoon, will cost nearly $9.7 billion. There's a host of other examples. And over the long term, we should keep in mind that, for example, the Parris Island Marine Corps Recruit Depot, where I've been, faces major challenges from rising sea levels, as do other coastal installations in Florida, California, all across the country. So The U.S. military, whether anyone in the political arena wants to admit it or not, has to account for a changing climate, whether it's building seawalls at bases here at home, making preparations for hotter temperatures for troops stationed in the Middle East or Africa, or even trying to rebuild our fleet of icebreakers because melting sea ice is opening up new shipping lanes and naval passages that our adversaries, Russia and China, are eager to capitalize on. So as somebody who's been covering energy on and off for more than 15 years and somebody covering the Pentagon now for going on a decade, I'm just always fascinated by the different perspectives on both sides of the aisle between the politically appointed leaders in any given administration, Democrat or Republican, and the women and men in the U.S. military who are tasked with actually doing the work and finding solutions to keep their colleagues and their installations safe, secure, and fully functional over the long term.
Yes, Ben, the intersection between politics and real rubber meets the road national security is something we're always trying to untangle and understand here on the podcast.
And we are honored now to be joined by Representative Mark Green. He's a Republican who has represented Tennessee's 7th Congressional District since 2019 and is the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Green graduated from West Point and served multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as I understand, took part in the mission to capture Saddam Hussein. A lot of listeners may not know you're also an ER physician. Congressman Green, thank you so much for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to be on the show.
I want to start with a couple of pieces of legislation out of your committee that cleared the full House this week and are headed to the Senate. The Decoupling from Foreign Adversarial Battery Dependence Act, which would prevent Department of Homeland Security from buying batteries from 6 Chinese companies closely linked to the CCP, and also the Shield Against the CCP Act, which would require DHS to establish a working group to examine threats posed by the CCP. I'm curious, sort of big picture to get us started here, Congressman, how far do you think the U.S. government and, the U.S. as a whole, as a country, needs to go in terms of banning the purchase of items made in China or the use of apps or other programs developed in China? Are we headed to a place where we need to reevaluate whether it's safe to buy computers like I'm using now or phones or other electronics from China? Should more apps beyond just TikTok be banned? When will you, as the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, feel satisfied with where we are in terms of dependence on China for this kind of stuff?
The question of what government is willing to do is really constrained by a couple of things: the will of the elected body, the will of the people, and the Constitution of the United States. Right. So I would submit to you. Let me sort of take your question up to the satellite view. China has taken overt threatening actions to the United States with the BRICS countries to destabilize the dollar. They have cyber hacked our telecommunications. They've cyber hacked our infrastructure. They are hacking our military all the time. They are doing intellectual property theft against our technology that is used for our military. They're a threat. They are trying to destabilize the United States with the fentanyl that's coming across, or had been coming across the southern border. It is an overt effort to displace the United States of America as a world hegemon and then have themselves be the sole hegemon. So, how much should we buy from China? I would submit to you as little as humanly possible. Granted, you take, for example, certain antibiotics, it's all made in China. We were asleep at the wheel as a country, both politically and in the private sector of the economy. We saw the dollar signs and we ran to China to manufacture cheaper and to open up their market. Well, they didn't open up the market. And when they did it in such a controlled manner that they could turn it off, and they did. I would submit to you we should buy as little as possible. I have bills also to bring manufacturing back to friendshoring, nearshoring, and I have a bill that brings businesses back to the United States and allows them to expense that move in year one on their tax write-off. We need to do everything we can to get manufacturing out of China and to create alternatives here in the United States and with friendly countries. I'll give you an example. We just had a briefing the other day about Bitcoin. And this is in the open source information. The Bitcoin mining machines are made in China. And we found next to our silos out in Wyoming, and this is, again, you can Google this article and pull it up, where they were building these massive energy consuming devices to mine Bitcoin right next to our missile silos. Very interesting. So the government shut that down. Well, next thing you know, they just rebuilt under another company name. What does Bitcoin do? It could definitely, those mining machines can definitely destabilize the grid, right? Because it just pulls so much power in. They're constantly, whether it's flying a spy balloon or, we're an enemy. Buy nothing from China.
Well, let me ask you, I'm glad that's a good segue into the next China question here before I bring Guy into the conversation. Your subcommittee on transportation and maritime security held a hearing a couple of weeks back on China's influence over the Panama Canal and other key strategic ports in the Western Hemisphere. And look, President Trump, as you know, has been mocked in some quarters for talking about taking back the Panama Canal, taking over Greenland. But from where you sit, is the U.S. vulnerable right now in places like Western Hemisphere ports or certain parts of the Arctic? And specifically, in as straightforward terms as you can, what should we be concerned about? Are we talking about the Chinese military using those kinds of locations as potential staging grounds or bases of operation to launch direct attacks against the U.S. homeland?
So your question is very broad in scope because you ask about locations and then you ask, is there a launch for military? Yes and no. Okay. So yes, on those strategic locations, for example, Straits of Malacca, Straits of Hormuz, they're connected with Iran, right? The ports that they have slowly accumulated all over the globe are in strategic choke points, and they are doing that with intention. Now, in terms of launching some kind of an attack, no, but depriving our Navy, depriving us of shipping, disrupting our supply chains, all of those things are possible to dissuade us. Look, the near-term objective of China is to dissuade us from being involved in Taiwan. That Xi Jinping has said he will take back Taiwan in his lifetime. And it's, after Putin and Ukraine, we got to start believing these totalitarian dictators again. When they tell us they're going to do something, we should be prepared for them to do it and take measures to prevent that if we can, and if not, to respond when they do. Yeah, I mean, China is absolutely, and look at Djibouti, their military forces there are huge and in a key place. I mean, Djibouti sits right as you would go into the Red Sea and then into the Suez Canal.
Chairman Green, it's Guy Taylor. Let's talk more broadly about President Trump's foreign policy tactics and dogma. You've been an outspoken supporter of a lot of his policies, but are you at all concerned? I think we're 7 weeks in now that things are moving a little too quickly, both on the tariffs front, but also with DOGE, with the cutting of U.S. aid, the potential damage that does to U.S. soft power projection to counter China in places like Africa or South America. Is there a danger that U.S. national security is being impacted in a negative way by the pace and scale of policy shift under Trump?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in Europe maybe 2-3 weeks ago and talking to someone, a business guy, and he was, in Western Europe, runs a couple of different companies, and clearly would vote Democrat if he were in the United States. Okay, but he's excited about a president, the first one he's seen in a long time, who just has chutzpah, who has guts to say, you know what, we're standing up for our country. They recognize the erudite ones don't, right? But the ones who actually think through it and say, wait a minute, we do need a strong America. It's okay if they turn inward for a little bit and strengthen themselves. That'll be best for us. They're not going to abandon their alliances. Those guys, the ones who can think through that, are like, yeah, we're okay with this short period of time. As far as foreign aid goes, look, it's just like compliance and cybersecurity. If you spend more time on compliance, you with the government's requirements, then you don't do a lot of cybersecurity. If you spend money teaching Moroccans how to make pottery, or how woke policies in an sub-African continent country is doing LGBT stuff, I mean, you're pissing those people off more than you're doing making a friend. The fact that they wanted to withhold PEPFAR money that would have helped AIDS patients survive if they didn't kill their babies in the womb and allow gay marriage, forcing our ideology on a country that pushed back on that. I mean, that was doing more harm than good. Reevaluation of all that foreign aid is a good thing. It's the right thing. And it allows us to take aid that was being wasted and put it in places where it'll be used for good. And so, is there some collateral damage? Absolutely. Will we have to come back and fix that collateral damage? Yes. Honestly, we weren't going to get it done without a wrecking ball. And that's what Elon is and those guys. So,
well, let me ask you quick as a follow-up how I guess how fast and hard the wrecking ball is going to move. Are you comfortable with Elon Musk seemingly opening the door to entitlement program cuts as he just did this week? I mean, you're an elected representative. Are you worried that older voters would punish Republicans, including you, if the administration and the DOGE go down this road? And also, as we said at the outset, you're a physician. So I'm curious how you would feel about any possible DOGE-driven plans to cut Medicare or Medicaid.
I'll be the first one to tell you there's waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid. And the system isn't set up to function in a way that allows a free market to set the price. So what we've got to do is get that free market back in the government assistance programs. And, because let's face it, I saw this in the VA and I saw this in military hospitals. When supply demand curve, pretty simple. When price is zero, there's no end to the demand and there's no supply that will ever meet the demand. So as long as it's free, 100% free, you'll never meet the demand. And that's really important to know. So I came up with an idea when I was a Tennessee state senator, sent it up here, and this was for Medicaid. Let's do a swipe card. Let's put $1,500 on there. Let's tell the patient, look, this is your money. This card only works at your doctor's office. It works at your pharmacy. It works at your hospital. This is your health care. Doesn't cost them a penny, but that's $1,500 for them to spend. And by the way, we spend on average $6,000, $7,000, and this was 8 to 10 years ago on a Medicaid patient in Tennessee. What you do when you hand it to them is you say, and oh, by the way, what you don't spend on this, you get back added to your earned income credit. So you've created something like a health savings account for patients that are on government assistance. But now they've got skin in the game, and so they shop for price. They look for and you tell the doctors when that card swipes, they get paid. They don't have to file a claim. They can't bill more than the Medicaid rates, but doctors will want that for their cash flow. So they'll start competing for these patients. If we don't put a free market back in healthcare, we can't fix healthcare, and we'll continue to have waste, fraud, and abuse.
Well, let's go back to foreign policy and global security. We're taping here on March 11 after talks in Saudi Arabia with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. A top Ukrainian delegation has agreed to push for a 30-day ceasefire. The U.S. side has agreed to lift Trump's pause on military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. We're all waiting now for Russia's reaction here. My question for you is the Trump administration giving away too much to the Russians here, or is that really a liberal trope and criticism of Trump? Can he end this war, and does he have to give a certain leeway for Moscow to engage in a major end of war negotiation?
Well, I like to say it like this. There's a number of things going on, and Trump plays four-dimensional chess. He's got to, if he bashes Putin, he won't get Putin to the table. So this criticism of Trump about being too nice to Putin, look, all of us have said Putin's a war criminal. He bombed hospitals. That's against the Geneva Convention. But if Trump is out there as the guy saying that, we're not going to get a deal. We need a deal. The Ukrainians don't have enough lives, and we don't have enough money to fight this war forever. Taking this to that sort of fourth dimension or the next dimension, what if Trump wants to separate Russia from China? What if there's a bigger goal here to actually, okay, let's get a peace deal in Ukraine, and then let's put a wedge between Russia and China? It's just possible that he's smarter than all of these idiots that are out there criticizing him.
Are you of the mind in your conversations with his top national security advisors that there's an embrace of the wedge strategy? This is something we've talked about here on the podcast and other threat status platforms, is whether or not he really wants to push that wedge strategy. Is that what you're seeing?
I have not spoken to Mike Walls or Trump about this. I just see the chess pieces moving and I go, aha, okay. But wouldn't it be fantastic if that wedge went between Russia and China? And oh, by the way, Russia became a negotiator to help us with Iran. Point I'm making is there's stuff going on below the surface that people don't, the idiot press doesn't get.
I did want to bring up violent extremism and the terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland. We had Robert Greenway from the Heritage Foundation on 2 weeks ago on the show, who said he thinks the terror threat to the U.S. right now is the highest it's been since at least since 9/11, if not even before that. So, look, your committee recently put out your terror threat snapshot, which I thought was a very chilling look at the number of domestic terror cases here at home. But I wanted to zero in on something a little more specific, and that is last week, David Gartenstein-Ross, an advisor on asymmetric warfare at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, testified at the subcommittee hearing on composite violent extremism, this idea that extremists today may not neatly fit into one ideological box, but could be angry at, women or any number of groups, or they hate Catholics or whatever the case may be. And that now with artificial intelligence, extremist groups can tailor content specifically designed to get that person angry and to commit acts of violence. So that sounds like a really terrifying and complex problem. Is AI raising the extremist threat level here at home? And if so, what is Congress doing about it?
Yeah, so we had a bill filed, I think it was last week, to create some study groups to just assess and then to build plans from at least the Homeland perspective, how we anticipate the use of AI as a weapon. Whether it's in the hands of violent extremists at home, like the New Orleans attack, where a guy gets radicalized by ISIS online, or, it's something overt from overseas. And we're basically directing and empowering and authorizing and getting money for Homeland to build this strategic group to assess the enemies or the bad guys' use of AI. And that bill, I think, was filed by August Pfluger last week. So yes, we are leaning forward in that, in the saddle on that. And I anticipate that piece of legislation will get marked up pretty quickly.
One last thing then, Congressman, in the last couple minutes we have. We've mentioned several times, you're, of course, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. We've had members of Congress on this podcast who believe that the homeland is threatened by mysterious, unidentified drones, perhaps flown by China, Russia, or Iran, or that they're some kind of cutting-edge military technology operated by defense contractors, outside the oversight of Congress, or, as you know, some even believe they might be extraterrestrial in nature. Where are you on this question? Are there UFOs or UAP, as they're now called, that represent an actual threat to the homeland today?
So I would tell you that there are absolutely drones that are a threat to the homeland. And some of those are spy drones that are gathering intelligence for the Chinese. We caught a guy as he was trying to exit the country after he flew a drone over our space base in California. And there's also the cartels that are using drones to facilitate their trafficking. Now we know with the border secured by the president, they're going to adjust their methods, and they're using drones. So I have a bill that I filed last Congress. It has to go through 4 committees because whenever you shoot down something, it involves the FAA, it involves justice, it involves Homeland, it involves DOD. So that bill, unfortunately, has to go through 4 committees. But we're refiling that. I think the plan is to drop it in a week or so, and it's the Countering UAS Act, and it actually will allow local law enforcement under the constraints established by DHS to shoot down drones. right now, only DHS and DOD have the authority to shoot down a drone. I think DOJ may. I'd have to look at that. They're not in my jurisdiction on Homeland, but this bill will define the parameters, define the equipment that can be used, and turn our law enforcement loose. Look, right now, a terrorist could fly a drone over an open NFL football stadium and hurt a lot of people. Those are no-fly zones, but just saying it's no-fly zone, as well as I do, fentanyl's illegal in the United States. There's a whole boatload of it here. We have to give the local law enforcement the power to take those drones down, and we intend to do that this Congress.
Congressman Mark Green, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Congressman.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically in the U.S., or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that President Trump has sparked a tariff war with U.S. allies that could have major blowback on the U.S. economy. The tariff war entered into force in recent days with the European Union announcing that it has imposed, quote, swift and proportionate, end quote, tariffs on U.S. goods after President Trump's imposition of 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the U.S. People may not think of aluminum imports as something that's going to impact them, Ben, but it has a direct connection to national security and the advanced tech, space, and other sectors. I made a visit a few months ago to a company in Long Beach, California called VAST that's building space stations. They are a major consumer of aluminum. Tariffs impact companies like this and how fast they can move out on the periphery of that tech innovation and ingenuity space on the West Coast and in other places around the United States where such manufacturing actually does happen. The EU tariffs on U.S. goods will affect everything from American farm goods to bourbon going towards Europe, Ben. And the same now goes for Canada, which as of March 13 is reported to be imposing about $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. My threat of the week, Ben, is that the blowback from this is potentially going to make prices higher over the coming months across the U.S. economy. Tariffs concerns have sent stocks reeling over the past several weeks, and there is serious risk that this could lead to a major global market downturn.
Yeah, speaking of the rubber meeting the road, we could be seeing that right now. My threat of the week is helicopter flights near Reagan Airport outside D.C. And of course, you're probably thinking I'm a couple weeks too late because the tragic fatal collision between a commercial airliner and an Army helicopter near that airport was all the way back in late January. But it's my threat of the week right now because this week we got a preliminary report from the National Transportation Safety Board that looked at both the specific circumstances around that January collision, which killed 67 people, but also broader issues at the airport. Now, listeners are probably aware, if you've flown in and out of that airport, that it's in a pretty unique and especially congested location along the Potomac River, especially with all these strict airspace restrictions over Washington, and the fact that some critics say it's too busy because practically every member of Congress wants a direct flight from Reagan as close to their home district as they can possibly get. So this NTSB report really sheds some light on just how problematic this is. I'd encourage listeners to go read the whole study, but here's one startling statistic. A review of nearly 1 million commercial arrivals and departures at the airport from October 2021 through the end of 2024 found 15,214 near collisions between commercial airplanes and helicopters with less than 400 feet of vertical separation. The NTSB said that certain helicopter routes and the proximity with which they can come to commercial planes are, quote, insufficient and pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety by increasing the chances of a mid-air collision, unquote. So honestly, when you read this, it almost seems like a miracle to me there aren't more deadly collisions at or near Reagan Airport. So it's absolutely a real threat right now, and that's why it's my threat of the week. And with that, thank you so much, Guy. A big thanks to you. A huge thanks to Mark Green, chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, for joining us here on the show this week. And thanks to all of you for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.